Now I thought of that moment, that fear in me at the very sight of the altar, the sound of the Pange Lingua, and I thought again persistently of my brother. I could see the coffin rolling up along the center aisle, the procession of mourners behind it. I felt no fear now. As I said, I think, if anything, I felt a longing for some fear, for some reason for fear as I moved slowly along the dark stone walls. The air was chill and damp in spite of summer. The thought of Claudia's doll came back to me. Where was that doll? For years Claudia had played with that doll. Suddenly I saw myself searching for the doll in the relentless and meaningless manner one searches for something in a nightmare. Coming on doors that won't open or drawers that won't shut, struggling over and over against the same meaningless thing, not knowing why the effort seems so desperate. Why the sudden sight of a chair with a shawl thrown over it inspires the mind with horror. I was in the cathedral. A woman stepped out of the confessional and past the long line of those who waited. A man who should have stepped up next did not move. And my eye, sensitive even in my vulnerable condition, noted this. And I turned to see him. He was staring at me. Quickly I turned my back on him. I heard him enter the confessional and shut the door. I walked up the aisle of the church and then, more from exhaustion than from any conviction, went into an empty pew and sat down. I had almost genuflected from old habit. My mind seemed as muddled and tortured as that of any human. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to banish all thoughts. Hear and see, I said to myself, and with this act of will my senses emerged from the torment. All around me in the gloom I heard the whisper of prayers, the tiny click of the rosary beads, soft the sighing of the woman who knelt now at the 12th station. Rising from the sea of wooden pews came the scent of rats, a rat moving somewhere near the altar, a rat in the great wood-carved side altar of the Virgin Mary. The gold candlesticks shimmered on the altar. A rich white chrysanthemum bent suddenly on its stem, droplets glistening on the crowded petals, a sour fragrance rising from a score of vases, from altars and side altars, from statues of virgins and Christs and saints. I stared at the statues. I became obsessed suddenly and completely with the lifeless profiles, the staring eyes, the empty hands, the frozen folds. Then my body convulsed with such violence that I found myself pitched forward. My hand on the pew before me. It was a cemetery of dead forms, a funeral effigy and stone angels. I looked up and saw myself in a most palpable vision ascending the altar steps, opening the tiny sacrosanct tabernacle, reaching with monstrous hands for the consecrated ciborium, and taking the body of Christ and strowing its white wafers all over the carpet, and walking then on the sacred wafers, walking up and down before the altar, giving Holy Communion to the dust. I rose up now in the pew and stood there staring at this vision. I knew full well the meaning of it. God did not live in this church. These statues gave an image to nothingness. I was the only supernatural in this cathedral. I was the only supermortal thing that stood conscious under this roof. Loneliness to the point of madness. The cathedral crumbled in my vision. The saints listed and fell. Rats ate the Holy Eucharist and nested on the sills. A solitary rat with an enormous tail stood tugging and gnawing at the rotted altar cloth until the candlesticks fell and rolled on the slime-covered stones. And I remained standing, untouched, undead, reaching out suddenly for the plaster hand of the Virgin, and seeing it break in my hand, so that I held the hand crumbling in my palm, the pressure of my thumb turning it to powder, and then suddenly through the ruins, up through the open door through which I could see a wasteland in all directions, even the great river frozen over, and stuck with the encrusted ruins of ships, up through these ruins now came a funeral procession, a band of pale white men and women, monsters with gleaming eyes and flowing black clothes. The coffin rumbling on the wooden wheels, the rats scurrying across the broken and buckling marble, the procession advancing so that I could see then Claudia in the procession, her eyes staring from behind a thin black veil, one gloved hand locked upon a black prayer book, the other on the coffin as it moved beside her. And there now in the coffin beneath the glass cover, I saw to my horror the skeleton of Lestat, the wrinkled skin now pressed into the very texture of his bones, his eyes but sockets, his blonde hair billowed on the white satin. The procession stopped. The mourners moved out, filling the dusty pews without a sound, and Claudia, turning with her book, opened it and lifted the veil back from her face, her eyes fixed on me as her finger touched the page. And now art thou cursed from the earth, she whispered, her whisper rising in echo in the ruins. And now art thou cursed from the earth which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand? When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth, and whoever slayeth thee, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. I shouted at her, I screamed, the scream rising up out of the depths of my being like some great rolling black force that broke from my lips and sent my body reeling against my will. A terrible sighing rose from the mourners, a chorus growing louder and louder, as I turned to see them all about me pushing me into the aisle against the very sides of the coffin, so that I turned to get my balance and found both my hands upon it. And I stood there staring down, not at the remains of Lestat, but at the body of my mortal brother. A quiet descended, as if a veil had fallen over all and made their forms dissolve beneath its soundless folds. There was my brother, blond and young and sweet, as he had been in life, as real and warm to me now as he'd been years and years beyond, which I could never have remembered him thus. So perfectly was he recreated, so perfectly in every detail. His blond hair brushed back from his forehead, his eyes closed as if he slept, his smooth fingers around the crucifix on his breast, his lips, so pink and silken, I could hardly bear to see them and not touch them. And as I reached out just to touch the softness of his skin, the vision ended. I was sitting still in the Saturday night cathedral, the smell of the tapers thick in the motionless air, the woman of the stations gone and darkness gathering behind me, across from me, and now above me. A boy appeared in the black cassock of a lay brother, with a long extinguisher on a golden pole, putting its little funnel down upon one candle, and then another, and then another. I was stupefied. He glanced at me and then away, as if not to disturb a man deep in prayer. And then, as he moved on up to the next chandelier, I felt a hand on my shoulder. That two humans should pass this close to me without my hearing, without my even caring, registered somewhere within me that I was in danger, but I did not care. I looked up now and saw a gray-haired priest. "You wish to go to confession?" he asked. I was about to lock up the church. He narrowed his eyes behind his thick glasses. The only light now came from the racks of little red glass candles, which burned before the saints, and shadows leaped upon the towering walls. "You are troubled, aren't you? Can I help you?" "It's too late, I whispered to him and rose to go. He backed away from me, still apparently unaware of anything about my appearance that should alarm him, and said kindly to reassure me, "No, it's still early. Do you want to come into the confessional?" For a moment I just stared at him. I was tempted to smile. And then it occurred to me to do it, but even as I followed him down the aisle, in the shadows of the vestibule, I knew this would be nothing, that it was madness. Nevertheless, I knelt down in the small wooden booth, my hands folded on the prie-dieu as he sat in the booth beside it, and slid back the panel to show me the dim outline of his profile. I stared at him for a moment, and then I said it, lifting my hand to make the sign of the cross, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned so often and so long I do not know how to change, nor how to confess before God what I've done." "Son, God is infinite in his capacity to forgive," he whispered to me. "Tell him in the best way you know how, and from your heart. Murders, Father, death after death. The woman who died 2 nights ago in Jackson Square, I killed her. And thousands of others before her, 1 and 2 a night, Father, for 70 years. I have walked the streets of New Orleans like the grim reaper and fed on human life for my own existence. I am not mortal, Father, but immortal and damned. Like angels put in hell by God, I am a vampire." The priest turned. "What is this? Some sort of sport for you? Some joke? You take advantage of an old man?" he said. He slid the wooden panel back with a splat. Quickly I opened the door and stepped out to see him standing there. "Young man, do you fear God at all? Do you know the meaning of sacrilege?" He glared at me. Now I moved closer to him, slowly, very slowly. And at first he merely stared at me outraged. Then, confused, he took a step back. The church was hollow, empty, black, the sacristan gone, and the candles throwing ghastly light only on the distant altars. They made a wreath of soft gold fibers about his gray head and face. "Then there is no mercy," I said to him, and suddenly clamping my hands on his shoulders, I held him in a preternatural lock, from which he couldn't hope to move, and held him close beneath my face. His mouth fell open in horror. Do you see what I am? Why, if God exists, does he suffer me to exist? I said to him. You talk of sacrilege. He dug his nails into my hands, trying to free himself, his missal dropping to the floor, his rosary clattering in the folds of his cassock. He might as well have fought the animated statues of the saints. I drew my lips back and showed him my virulent teeth. Why does he suffer me to live? I said. His face infuriated me, his fear, his contempt, his rage. I saw in it all the hatred I'd seen in Babette, and he hissed at me. Let me go, devil, in sheer mortal panic. I released him, watching with a sinister fascination as he floundered, moving up the center aisle as if he plowed through snow. And then I was after him, so swift that I surrounded him in an instant with my outstretched arms, my cape throwing him into darkness, his legs scrambling still. He was cursing me, calling on God at the altar. And then I grabbed him on the very steps to the communion rail and pulled him down to face me there and sank my teeth into his neck. The vampire stopped. Some time before, the boy had been about to light a cigarette, and he sat now with the match in one hand, the cigarette in the other. Still as a store dummy, staring at the vampire was looking at the floor. He turned suddenly, took the book of matches from the boy's hand, struck the match, and held it out. The boy bent the cigarette to receive it. He inhaled and let the smoke out quickly. He uncapped the bottle and took a deep drink, his eyes always on the vampire. He was patient again, waiting until the vampire was ready to resume. I didn't remember Europe from my childhood, not even the voyage to America, really. That I had been born there was an abstract idea. Yet it had a hold over me which was as powerful as the hold France can have on a colonial. I spoke French, read French, remembered waiting for the reports of the Revolution, and reading the Paris newspaper accounts of Napoleon's victories. I remember the anger I felt when he sold the colony of Louisiana to the United States. How long the mortal Frenchman lived in me, I don't know. He was gone by this time, really, but there was in me that great desire to see Europe and to know it, which comes not only from the reading of all the literature and the philosophy, but from the feeling of having been shaped by Europe more deeply and keenly than the rest of Americans. I was a Creole who wanted to see where it had all begun. And so I turned my mind to this now, to divesting my closets and trunks of everything that was not essential to me, and very little was essential to me, really. And much of that night remained in the townhouse, to which I was certain I would return sooner or later, if only to move my possessions to another similar one and start a new life in New Orleans. I couldn't conceive of leaving it forever. Wouldn't, but I fixed my mind and heart on Europe. It began to penetrate for the first time that I might see the world if I wanted, that I was, as Claudia said, free. Meantime, she made a plan. It was her idea, most definitely, that we must go first to Central Europe, where the vampires seemed most prevalent. She was certain we could find something there that would instruct us, explain our origins, but she seemed anxious for more than answers. A communion with her own kind. She mentioned this over and over, my own kind. And she said it with a different intonation that I might have used. She made me feel the gulf that separated us. In the first years of our life together, I had thought her like Lestat, imbibing his instinct to kill, though she shared my tastes and everything else. Now I knew her to be less human than either of us might have dreamed. Not the faintest conception bound her to the sympathies of human existence. Perhaps this explained why, despite everything I had done or failed to do, she clung to me. I was not her own kind, merely the closest thing to it. But wouldn't it have been possible, asked the boy suddenly, to instruct her in the ways of the human heart the way you'd instructed her in everything else? To what avail, asked the vampire frankly, so she might suffer as I did? Oh, I'll grant you I should have taught her something to prevail. Against her desire to kill Lestat, for my own sake, I should have done that. But you see, I had no confidence in anything else. Once fallen from grace, I had confidence in nothing. The boy nodded. I didn't mean to interrupt you. You were coming to something, he said. Only to the point that it was possible to forget what had happened to Lestat, by turning my mind to Europe. And the thought of the other vampires inspired me also. I had not been cynical for one moment about the existence of God. Only lost from it, drifting preternatural through the natural world. But we had another matter before we left for Europe. Oh, a great deal happened indeed. It began with the musician. He had called while I was gone that evening to the cathedral, and the next night he was to come again. I had dismissed the servants and went down to him myself, and his appearance startled me at once. He was much thinner than I'd remembered him and very pale, with a moist gleam about his face that suggested fever. And he was perfectly miserable. When I told him Lestat had gone away, he refused at first to believe me, and began insisting Lestat would have left him some message, something. And then he went off up the Rue Royale, talking to himself about it, as if he had little awareness of anyone around him. I caught up with him under a gas lamp. He did leave you something, I said, quickly, feeling for my wallet. I didn't know how much I had in it, but I planned to give it to him. It was several $100s. I put it into his hands. They were so thin I could see the blue veins pulsing beneath the watery skin. Now he became exultant, and I sensed at once that the matter went beyond the money. Then he spoke of me. He told you to give this to me, he said, holding onto it as though it were a relic. He must have said something else to you. He stared at me with bulging, tortured eyes. I didn't answer him at once, because during these moments I had seen the puncture wounds in his neck, 2 red scratch-like marks to the right, just above his soiled collar. The money flapped in his hand. He was oblivious to the evening traffic of the street, the people who pushed close around us. Put it away, I whispered. He did speak of you, that it was important you go on with your music. He stared at me as if anticipating something else. Yes. Did he say anything else? He asked me. I didn't know what to tell him. I would have made up anything if it would have given him comfort, and also kept him away. It was painful for me to speak of Lestat. The words evaporated on my lips. And the puncture wounds amazed me. I couldn't fathom this. I was saying nonsense to the boy finally, that Lestat wished him well, that he had to take a steamboat up to St. Louis, that he would be back, that war was imminent and he had business there, the boy hungering after every word, as if he couldn't possibly get enough and was pushing on with it for the thing he wanted. He was trembling. The sweat broke out fresh on his forehead as he stood there pressing me, and suddenly he bit his lip hard and said, "But why did he go?" as if nothing had sufficed. "What is it?" I asked him. "What did you need from him? I'm sure he would want me to." "He was my friend." He turned on me suddenly, his voice dropping with repressed outrage. "You're not well," I said to him. "You need rest. There's something," and now I pointed to it, attentive to his every move, "on your throat." He didn't even know what I meant. His fingers searched for the place, found it, rubbed it. "What does it matter? I don't know. The insects, they're everywhere," he said, turning away from me. "Did he say anything else?" For a long while I watched him move up the Rue Royale, a frantic, lanky figure in rusty black for whom the bulk of the traffic made way. I told Claudia at once about the wound on his throat. It was our last night in New Orleans. We'd board the ship just before midnight tomorrow for an early morning departure. We had agreed to walk out together. She was being solicitous, and there was something remarkably sad in her face, something which had not left after she had cried. What could the marks mean, she asked me now. That he fed on the boy when the boy slept? That the boy allowed it? I can't imagine, she said. Yes, that must be what it is. But I was uncertain. I remembered now Lestat's remark to Claudia, that he knew a boy who would make a better vampire than she. Had he planned to do that? Planned to make another one of us? It doesn't matter now, Louis, she reminded me. We had to say our farewell to New Orleans. We were walking away from the crowds of the Rue Royale. My senses were keen to all around me, holding it close, reluctant to say this was the last night. The old French city had been, for the most part, burned a long time ago, and the architecture of these days was, as it is now, Spanish, which meant that as we walked slowly through the very narrow street, where one cabriolet had to stop for another, we passed whitewashed walls and great courtyard gates that revealed distant lamplit courtyard paradises like our own. Only each seemed to hold such promise, such sensual mystery. Great banana trees stroked the galleries of the inner courts, and masses of fern and flower crowded the mouth of the passage. Above in the dark, figures sat on the balconies, their backs to the open doors, their hushed voices and the flapping of their fans barely audible above the soft river breeze. And over the walls grew wisteria and passiflora so thick that we could brush against it, as we passed and stopped occasionally at this place or that to pluck a luminescent rose or tendrils of honeysuckle. Through the high windows we saw again and again the play of candlelight on richly embossed plaster ceilings, and often the bright iridescent wreath of a crystal chandelier. Occasionally a figure dressed for evening appeared at the railings, the glitter of jewels at her throat, her perfume adding a lush evanescent spice to the flowers in the air. We had our favorite streets, gardens, corners, but inevitably we reached the outskirts of the old city and saw the rise of swamp. Carriage after carriage passed us coming in from the Bayou Road, bound for the theater or the opera, but now the lights of the city lay behind us, and its mingled scents were drowned in the thick odor of swamp decay. The very sight of the tall, wavering trees, their limbs hung with moss, had sickened me, made me think of Lestat. I was thinking of him as I thought of my brother's body. I was seeing him sunk deep among the roots of cypress and oak, that hideous withered form folded in the white sheet. I wondered if the creatures of the dark shunned him, knowing instinctively the parched, crackling thing there was virulent, or whether they swarmed about him in the reeking water, picking his ancient dried flesh from the bones. I turned away from the swamps back to the heart of the old city and felt the gentle press of Claudia's hand comforting. She had gathered a natural bouquet from all the garden walls, and she held it crushed to the bosom of her yellow dress, her face buried in its perfume. Now she said to me in such a whisper that I bent my ear to her, "Louis, it troubles you, you know the remedy. Let the flesh instruct the mind." She let my hand go, and I watched her move away from me, turning once to whisper the same command. "Forget him, let the flesh instruct the mind." It brought back to me that book of poems I'd held in my hand when she first spoke these words to me, and I saved the verse upon the page. Her lips were red, her looks were free, her locks were yellow as gold, her skin was as white as leprosy. The nightmare, life in death, was she, who thicks man's blood with cold. She was smiling from the far corner, a bit of yellow silk, visible for a moment in the narrowing dark, then gone. My companion forever. I was turning into the Rue du Maine, moving past darkened windows. A lamp died very slowly behind a broad scrim of heavy lace, the shadow of the pattern on the brick expanding, growing fainter, then vanishing into blackness. I moved on, nearing the house of Madame Leclerc, hearing faint but shrill the violins from the upstairs parlor, and then the thin metallic laughter of the guests. I stood across from the house in the shadows, seeing a small handful of them moving in the lighted room. From window to window to window moved one guest, a pale lemon-colored wine in his stem glass, his face turned towards the moon as if he sought something from a better vantage and found it finally at the last window, his hand on the dark drape. Across from me a door stood open in the brick wall, and a light fell on the passage at the far end. I moved silently over the narrow street and met the thick aromas of the kitchen rising on the air past the gate, the slightly nauseating smell of cooking meat. I stepped into the passage. Someone had just walked fast across the courtyard and shut a rear door. But then I saw another figure. She stood by the kitchen fire, a lean, black woman with a brilliant tignon around her head, her features delicately chiseled and gleaming in the light like a figure in diorite. She stirred the mixture in the kettle. I caught the sweet smell of the spices and the fresh green marjoram and bay, and then in a wave came the horrid smell of the cooking meat, the blood and flesh decaying in the boiling fluids. I drew near and saw her set down her long iron spoon and stand with her hands on her generous tapered hips, the white of her apron sash outlining her small fine waist. The juices of the pot foamed on the lip and spit in the glowing coals below. Her dark odor came to me, her dusky spice perfume, stronger than the curious mixture from the pot, tantalizing as I drew nearer and rested back against the wall of matted vine. Upstairs, the thin violins began a waltz, and the floorboards groaned with the dancing couples. The jasmine of the wall enclosed me, and then receded like water, leaving the clean-swept beach. And again I sensed her salt perfume. She had moved to the kitchen door, her long black neck gracefully bent as she peered into the shadows beneath the lighted window. "Monsieur," she said, and stepped out now into the shaft of yellow light. It fell on her great round breasts and long sleek silken arms, and now on the long cold beauty of her face. "You're looking for the party, monsieur?" she asked. "The party's upstairs." "No, my dear, I wasn't looking for the party," I said to her, moving forward out of the shadows. "I was looking for you." Everything was ready when I woke the next evening. The wardrobe trunk on its way to the ship, as well as chest which contained a coffin, the servants gone, the furnishings draped in white, the sight of the tickets and a collection of notes of credit and some other papers all placed together in a flat black wallet made the trip emerge into the bright light of reality. I would have foregone killing had that been possible, and so I took care of this early and perfunctorily, as did Claudia, and as it neared time for us to leave, I was alone in the flat waiting for her. She had been gone too long for my nervous frame of mind. I feared for her, though she could bewitch almost anyone into assisting her if she found herself too far away from home, and had many times persuaded strangers to bring her to her very door, to her father, who thanked them profusely for returning his lost daughter. When she came now, she was running, and I fancied as I put my book down that she had forgotten the time. She thought it later than it was. By my pocket watch we had an hour, but the instant she reached the door I knew that this was wrong. "Louis, the doors!" she gasped, her chest heaving, her hand at her heart. She ran back down the passage with me behind her, and, as she desperately signaled me, I shut up the doors to the gallery. "What is it?" I asked her. "What's come over you?" But she was moving to the front windows now, the long French windows which opened onto the narrow balconies over the street. She lifted the shade of the lamp and quickly blew out the frame. The room went dark and then lightened gradually with the illumination of the street. She stood panting, her hand on her breast, and then she reached out for me and drew me close to her beside the window. "Someone followed me," she whispered now. "I could hear him block after block behind me. At first I thought it was nothing." She stopped for breath, her face blanched in the bluish light that came from the windows across the way. "Louis, it was the musician," she whispered. "But what does that matter? He must have seen you with Lestat." "Louis, he's down there. Look out the window. Try to see him." She seemed so shaken, almost afraid, as if she would not stand exposed on the threshold. I stepped out on the balcony, though I held her hand as she hovered by the drape, and she held me so tightly that it seemed she feared for me. It was 11 o'clock, and the Rue Royale for the moment was quiet. Shops shut, the traffic of the theater just gone away. A door slammed somewhere to my right, and I saw a woman and a man emerge and hurry towards the corner, the woman's face hidden beneath an enormous white hat. Their steps died away. I could see no one, sense no one. I could hear Claudia's labored breathing. Something stirred in the house. I started, then recognized it as the jingling and rustling of the birds. We'd forgotten the birds, but Claudia had started worse than I, and she pulled near to me. "There is no one, Claudia," I started to whisper to her. Then I saw the musician. He had been standing so still in the doorway of the furniture shop that I had been totally unaware of him, and he must have wanted this to be so, for now he turned his face upwards towards me, and it shone from the dark like a white light. The frustration and care were utterly erased from his stark features. His great dark eyes peered at me from the white flesh. He had become a vampire. "I see him," I murmured to her, my lips as still as possible, my eyes holding his eyes. I felt her move closer, her hand trembling, a heart beating in the palm of her hand. She let out a gasp when she saw him now, but at that same moment something chilled me even as I stared at him, and he did not move. Because I heard a step in the lower passage, I heard the gate hinge groan. And then that step again, deliberate, loud, echoing under the arched ceiling of the carriageway. Deliberate, familiar. That step advancing now up the spiral stairs. A thin scream rose from Claudia, and then she caught it at once with her hand. The vampire in the furniture shop door had not moved, and I knew the step on the stairs. I knew the step on the porch. It was Lestat pulling on the door, now pounding on it, now ripping at it, as if to tear it loose from the very wall. Claudia moved back into the corner of the room, her body bent, as if someone had struck her a sharp blow, her eyes moving frantically from the figure in the street to me. The pounding on the door grew louder, and then I heard his voice. "Louis!" he called to me. "Louis!" he roared against the door. And then came the smash of the back parlor window, and I could hear the latch turning from within. Quickly, I grabbed the lamp, struck a match hard, and broke it in my frenzy, then got the flame as I wanted it, and held a small vessel of kerosene poised in my hand. "Get away from the window! Shut it!" I told her, and she obeyed as if the sudden clear-spoken command released her from a paroxysm of fear. "And light the other lamps, now, at once!" I heard her crying as she struck the match. Lestat was coming down the hallway. And then he stood at the door. I let out a gasp, and not meaning to, I must have taken several steps backwards when I saw him. I could hear Claudia's cry. It was Lestat beyond question, restored and intact, as he hung in the doorway, his head thrust forward, his eyes bulging as if he were drunk and needed the door jamb to keep him from plunging headlong into the room. His skin was a mass of scars, a hideous covering of injured flesh, as though every wrinkle of his death had left its mark upon him. He was seared and marked as if by the random strokes of a hot poker, and his once clear grey eyes were shot with hemorrhaged vessels. "Stay back, for the love of God," I whispered. "I'll throw it at you. I'll burn you alive," I said to him. And at the same moment, I could hear a sound to my left, something scratching against the facade of the townhouse. It was the other one. I saw his hands now on the wrought iron balcony. Claudia let out a piercing scream as he threw his weight against the glass doors. I cannot tell you all that happened then. I cannot possibly recount it as it was. I remember heaving the lamp at Lestat. It smashed at his feet, and the flames rose at once from the carpet. I had a torch then in my hands, a great tangle of sheet I'd pulled from the couch and ignited in the flames. But I was struggling with him before that, kicking and driving savagely at his great strength. And somewhere in the background were Claudia's panic screams, and the other lamp was broken, and the drapes of the windows blazed. I remember that his clothes reeked of kerosene and that he was at one point smacking wildly at the flames. He was clumsy, sick, unable to keep his balance, but when he had me in his grip, I even tore at his fingers with my teeth to get him off. There was a noise rising in the street, shouts, the sound of a bell. The room itself had fast become an inferno, and I did see in one clear blast of light Claudia battling the fledgling vampire. He seemed unable to close his hands on her, like a clumsy human after a bird. I remember rolling over and over with Lestat in the flames, feeling the suffocating heat in my face, seeing the flames above his back when I rolled under him. And then Claudia rose up out of the confusion and was striking at him over and over with the poker until his grip broke and I scrambled loose from him. I saw the poker coming down again and again on him and could hear the snarls rising from Claudia in time with the poker, like the stress of an unconscious animal. Lestat was holding his hand, his face a grimace of pain. And there, sprawled on the smoldering carpet, lay the other one, blood flowing from his head. What happened then is not clear to me. I think I grabbed the poker from her and gave him one fine blow with it to the side of the head. I remember that he seemed unstoppable, invulnerable to the blows. The heat by this time was singeing my clothes. Had caught Claudia's gossamer gown so that I grabbed her up and ran down the passage, trying to stifle the flames with my body. I remember taking off my coat and beating at the flames in the open air, and men rushing up the stairs and past me. A great crowd swelled from the passage into the courtyard, and someone stood on the sloped roof of the brick kitchen. I had Claudia in my arms now and was rushing past them all, oblivious to the questions, thrusting a shoulder through them, making them divide. And then I was free with her, hearing her pant and sob in my ear, running blindly down the Rue Royale, down the first narrow street, running and running until there was no sound but the sound of my running and her breath. And we stood there, the man and the child, scorched and aching, and breathing deep in the quiet of night. All night long I stood on the deck of the French ship Mariana, watching the gangplanks. The long levee was crowded and parties lasted late in the lavish staterooms, the decks rumbling with passengers and guests. But finally, as the hours moved toward dawn, the parties were over one by one, and carriages left the narrow riverfront streets. A few late passengers came aboard, a couple lingered for hours at the rail nearby, but Lestat and his apprentice, if they survived the fire, and I was convinced that they had, did not find their way to the ship. Our luggage had left the flat that day, and if anything, had remained to let them know our destination. I was sure it had been destroyed. Yet still I watched. Claudia sat securely locked in our stateroom, her eyes fixed on the porthole, but Lestat did not come. Finally, as I'd hoped, the commotion of putting out commenced before daylight. A few people waved from the pier and the grassy hump of the levee as the great ship began first to shiver, then to jerk violently to one side, and then to slide out in one great majestic motion into the current of the Mississippi. The lights of New Orleans grew small and dim until there appeared behind us only a pale phosphorescence against the lightning clouds. I was fatigued beyond my worst memory, yet I stood on the deck for as long as I could see that fight, knowing that I might never see it again. In moments we were carried downstream past the piers of Frenières and Point du Lac, and then as I could see the great wall of cottonwood and cypress growing green out of the darkness along the shore, I knew it was almost morning, too perilously close. And as I put the key into the lock of the cabin, I felt the greatest exhaustion perhaps that I'd ever known. Never in all the years I'd lived in our select family had I known the fear I'd experienced tonight, the vulnerability, the sheer terror. And there was to be no sudden relief from it, no sudden sense of safety, only that relief which weariness at last imposes when neither mind nor body can endure the terror any longer. For though Lestat was now miles away from us, he had in his resurrection awakened in me a tangle of complex fears, which I could not escape. Even as Claudia said to me, "We're safe, Louis, we're safe," and I whispered the word yes to her, I could see Lestat hanging in the doorway, see those bulbous eyes, that scarred flesh. How had he come back? How had he triumphed over death? How could any creature have survived that shriveled ruin he'd become? Whatever the answer, what did it mean, not only for him, but for Claudia? For me, safe from him we were, but safe from ourselves. The ship was struck by a strange fever. It was amazingly clean of vermin. However, though occasionally their bodies might be found, weightless and dry, as if the creatures had been dead for days, yet there was this fever. It struck a passenger first in the form of weakness and a soreness about the throat. Occasionally there were marks there, and occasionally the marks were someplace else, or sometimes there was no recognizable marks at all, though an old wound was reopened and painful again. And sometimes the passenger who fell to sleeping more and more as the voyage progressed and the fever progressed died in his sleep. So there were burials at sea on several occasions as we crossed the Atlantic. Naturally afraid of fever, I shunned the passengers, did not wish to join them in the smoking room, get to know their stories, hear their dreams and expectations. I took my meals alone, but Claudia liked to watch the passengers, to stand on deck and see them come and go in the early evening, to say softly to me later as I sat at the porthole, "I think she'll fall prey." I would put the book down and look out the porthole, feeling the gentle rocking of the sea, seeing the stars, more clear and brilliant than they had ever been on land, dipping down to touch the waves. It seemed at moments when I sat alone in the dark stateroom that the sky had come down to meet the sea, and that some great secret was to be revealed in that meeting, some great gulf miraculously closed forever. But who was to make this revelation when the sky and sea became indistinguishable, and neither any longer was chaos, God, or Satan? It struck me suddenly what consolation it would be to know Satan, to look upon his face, no matter how terrible that countenance was, to know that I belonged to him totally, and thus put to rest forever the torment of this ignorance, to step through some veil that would forever separate me from all that I called human nature. I felt the ship moving closer and closer to this secret. There was no visible end to the firmament. It closed about us with breathtaking beauty and silence, but then the words put to rest became horrible, because there would be no rest in damnation, could be no rest, and what was this torment compared to the restless fires of hell? The sea rocking beneath those constant stars, those stars themselves, what had this to do with Satan and those images which sound so static to us in childhood, when we are all so taken up with mortal frenzy that we can scarce imagine them desirable? Seraphim gazing forever upon the face of God, and the face of God itself, this was rest eternal, of which this gentle cradling sea was only the faintest promise. But even in these moments, when the ship slept and all the world slept, neither heaven nor hell seemed more than a tormenting fancy. To know, to believe in one or the other, that was perhaps the only salvation for which I could dream. Claudia, with Lestat's liking for light, lit the lamps when she rose. She had a marvelous pack of playing cards acquired from a lady on board. The picture cards were in the fashion of Marie Antoinette, and the backs of the cards bore gold fleurs-de-lis on gleaming violet. She played a game of solitaire in which the cards made the numbers of a clock. And she asked me until I finally began to answer her. How Lestat had accomplished it. She was no longer shaken. If she remembered her screams in the fire, she did not care to dwell on them. If she remembered that before the fire she had wept real tears in my arms, it made no change in her. She was, as always in the past, a person of little indecision, a person for whom habitual quiet did not mean anxiety or regret. We should have burned him, she said. We were fools to think from his appearance that he was dead. But how could he have survived? I asked her. You saw him. You know what became of him. I had no taste for it, really. I would have gladly pushed it to the back of my mind, but my mind would not allow me to. And it was she who gave me the answers now, for the dialogue was really with herself. Suppose, though he had ceased to fight us, she explained, that he was still living, locked in that helpless dried corpse, conscious and calculating. Conscious in that state, I whispered. And suppose when he reached the swamp waters and heard the sounds of our carriage going away, that he had strength enough to propel those limbs to move. There were creatures all around him in the dark. I saw him once rip the head of a small garden lizard and watch the blood run down into a glass. Can you imagine the tenacity of the will to live in him, his hands groping in that water for anything that moved? The will to live, tenacity, I murmured. Suppose it was something else. And then, when he'd felt the resuscitation of his strength, just enough perhaps to have sustained him to the road, somewhere along that road he found someone. Perhaps he crouched, waiting for a passing carriage. Perhaps he crept, gathering still what blood he could, until he came to the shacks of those immigrants, or those scattered country houses. And what a spectacle he must have been! She gazed at the hanging lamp, her eyes narrow, her voice muted, without emotion. And then what did he do? It's clear to me. If he could not have gotten back to New Orleans in time, he could most definitely have reached the old Bayou Cemetery. The charity hospital feeds it fresh coffins every day, and I can see him clawing his way through the moist earth for such a coffin, dumping the fresh contents out in the swamps and securing himself until the next nightfall in that shallow grave where no manner of man would be wont to disturb him. Yes, that is what he did, I'm certain. I thought of this for a long time, picturing it, seeing that it must have happened. And then I heard her add thoughtfully as she laid down her card and looked at the oval face of a white-coiffed king, I could have done it. And why do you look that way at me? She asked, gathering up her cards, her small fingers, struggling to make a neat pack of them and then to shuffle them. But you do believe that had we burned his remains he would have died? I asked. Of course I believe it. If there is nothing to rise, there is nothing to rise. What are you driving at? She was dealing out the cards now, dealing a hand for me on the small oak table. I looked at the cards, but I did not touch them. I don't know, I whispered to her. Only that perhaps there was no will to live, no tenacity, because very simply there was no need of either. Her eyes gazed at me steadily, giving no hint of her thoughts or that she understood mine. But because perhaps he wasn't capable of dying, perhaps he is and we are truly immortal. For a long time she sat there looking at me. Consciousness in that state, I finally added as I looked away from her. If it were so, then mightn't there be consciousness in any other? Fire, sunlight, what does it matter? Louis, she said, her voice soft. You're afraid. You don't stand en garde against fear. You don't understand the danger of fear itself. We'll know these answers when we find those who can tell us, those who've possessed knowledge for centuries, for however long creatures such as ourselves have walked the earth. That knowledge was our birthright, and he deprived us. He earned his death. But he didn't die, I said. He's dead, she said. No one could have escaped that house unless they'd run with us at our very side. No, he's dead, and so is that trembling aesthete, his friend. Consciousness, what does it matter? She gathered up the cards and put them aside, gesturing for me to hand her the books from the table beside the bunk. Those books, which she'd unpacked immediately on board, the few select records of vampire lore, which she'd taken to be her guides. They included no wild romances from England, no stories of Edgar Allan Poe, no fancy. Only those few accounts of the vampires of Eastern Europe, which had become for her a sort of Bible. In those countries, indeed, they did burn the remains of the vampire when they found him. And the heart was staked, and the head severed. She would read these now for hours, these ancient books which had been read and reread before they ever found their way across the Atlantic. They were travelers' tales, the accounts of priests and scholars. And she would plan our trip not with the need of any pen or paper, only in her mind, a trip that would take us at once away from the glittering capitals of Europe, towards the Black Sea, where we would dock at Varna and begin that search in the rural countryside of the Carpathians. For me it was a grim prospect, bound as I was to it, for there were longings in me for other places, and other knowledge which Claudia did not begin to comprehend. Seeds of these longings had been planted in me years ago, seeds which came to bitter flower as our ship passed through the Straits of Gibraltar and into the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. I wanted those waters to be blue, and they were not. They were the nighttime waters, and how I suffered then straining to remember the seas that a young man's untutored senses had taken for granted, that an undisciplined memory had let slip away for eternity. The Mediterranean was black, black off the coast of Italy, black off the coast of Greece, black always, black when in the small cold hours before dawn, as even Claudia slept, weary of her books and the meagre fare that caution allowed her vampire hunger, I lowered a lantern down through the rising vapor, until the fire blazed right over the lapping waters, and nothing came to light on that heaving surface but the light itself, the reflection of that being traveling constant with me, a steady eye which seemed to fix on me from the depths and say, "Louis, your quest is for darkness only. This sea is not your sea. The myths of men are not your myths. Men's treasures are not yours." But oh, how the quest for the old world vampires filled me with bitterness in those moments, a bitterness I could all but taste, as if the very air had lost its freshness. For what secrets, what truths had those monstrous creatures of night to give us? What, of necessity, must be their terrible limits, if indeed we were to find them at all? What can the damned really say to the damned? I never stepped ashore at Piraeus, yet in my mind I roamed the Acropolis at Athens, watching the moon rise through the open roof of the Parthenon, measuring my height by the grandeur of those columns, walking the streets of those Greeks who died at Marathon, listening to the sound of wind in the ancient olives. These were the monuments of men who could not die, not the stones of the living dead, here the secrets that had endured the passage of time, which I had only dimly begun to understand. And yet nothing turned me from our quest, and nothing could turn me. But over and over, committed as I was, I pondered the great risk of our questions, the risk of any question that is truthfully asked. For the answer must carry an incalculable price, a tragic danger. Who knew that better than I, who had presided over the death of my own body, seeing all I called human wither and die, only to form an unbreakable chain which held me fast to this world, yet made me forever its exile, a spectre with a beating heart. The sea lulled me to bad dreams, to sharp remembrances, a winter night in New Orleans when I wandered through the St. Louis cemetery and saw my sister, old and bent, a bouquet of white roses in her arms, the thorns carefully bound in an old parchment, her gray head bowed, her steps carrying her steadily along through the perilous dark to the grave where the stone of her brother Louis was set, side by side with that of his younger brother, Louis, who had died in the fire of Pointe du Lac, leaving a generous legacy to a godchild and namesake she never knew. Those flowers were for Louis, as if it had not been half a century since his death, as if her memory, like Louis's memory, left her no peace. Sorrow sharpened her ashen beauty. Sorrow bent her narrow back. And what I would not have given as I watched her to touch her silver hair, to whisper love to her, if love would not have loosed on her remaining years a horror worse than grief. I left her with grief over and over and over. And I dreamed now too much. I dreamed too long. In the prison of this ship, in the prison of my body, attuned as it was to the rise of every sun, as no mortal body had ever been. And my heart beat faster for the mountains of Eastern Europe, finally beat faster for the one hope that somewhere we might find in that primitive countryside the answer to why under God this suffering was allowed to exist, why under God it was allowed to begin, and how under God it might be ended. I had not the courage to end it, I knew, without that answer. And in time the waters of the Mediterranean became, in fact, the waters of the Black Sea. The vampire sighed. The boy was resting on his elbow, his face cradled in his right palm, and his avid expression was incongruous with the redness of his eyes. "Do you think I'm playing with you?" the vampire asked, his fine dark eyebrows knitted for an instant. "No," the boy said quickly. "I know better than to ask you any more questions. You'll tell me everything in your own time." And his mouth settled, and he looked at the vampire as though he were ready for him to begin again. There was a sound then far from off. It came from somewhere in the old Victorian building around them. The first such sound they'd heard. The boy looked up towards the hallway door. It was as if he'd forgotten the building existed. Someone walked heavily on the old boards, but the vampire was undisturbed. He looked away as if he were again disengaging himself from the present. That village. I can't tell you the name of it. The name's gone. I remember it was miles from the coast, however, and we'd been traveling alone by carriage. And such a carriage. It was Claudia's doing, that carriage, and I should have expected it. But then, things are always taking me unawares. From the first moment we arrived in Varna, I had perceived certain changes in her, which made me at once aware she was Lestat's daughter as well as my own. From me she had learned the value of money, but from Lestat she had inherited a passion for spending it, and she wasn't to leave without the most luxurious black coach we could manage, outfitted with leather seats that might have accommodated a band of travelers, let alone a man and a child who used the magnificent compartment only for the transportation of an ornately carved oak chest. To the back were strapped 2 trunks of the finest clothes the shops there could provide, and we went speeding along, those light, enormous wheels and fine springs carrying that bulk with a frightening ease over the mountain roads. There was a thrill to that when there was nothing else in this strange country. Those horses at a gallop and the gentle listing of that carriage. And it was strange country, lonely, dark as rural countries always dark, its castles and ruins often obscured when the moon passed behind the clouds. So that I felt an anxiety during those hours I'd never quite experienced in New Orleans. And the people themselves were no relief. We were naked and lost in their tiny hamlets, and conscious always that amongst them we were in grave danger. Never in New Orleans had to kill to be disguised. The ravages of fever, plague, crime, these things competed with us always there, and outdid us. But here we had to go to great lengths to make the kill unnoticed. Because these simple country people who might have found the crowded streets of New Orleans terrifying, believed completely that the dead did walk and did drink the blood of the living. They knew our names, vampire, devil, and we who were on the lookout for the slightest rumor, wanted under no circumstances to create rumor ourselves. We traveled alone and fast and lavishly amongst them, struggling to be safe within our ostentation, finding talk of vampires all too cheap by the inn fires, where, my daughter sleeping peacefully against my chest, I invariably found someone amongst the peasants or guests who spoke enough German, or at times even French, to discuss with me the familiar legends. But finally we came to that village which was to be the turning point in our travels. I savor nothing about that journey, not the freshness of the air, the coolness of the nights. I don't talk of it without a vague tremor, even now. We had been at a farmhouse the night before, and so no news prepared us, only the desolate appearance of the place, because it wasn't late when we reached it, not late enough for all the shutters of the little street to be bolted, or for a darkened lantern to be swinging from the broad archway in the inn. Refuse was collected in the doorways, and there were other signs that something was wrong. A small box of withered flowers beneath a shuttered shop window, a barrel rolling back and forth in the center of the inn yard. The place had the aspect of a town under siege by the plague. But even as I was setting Claudia down on the packed earth beside the carriage, I saw the crack of light beneath the inn door. "Put the hood of your cape up," she said quickly. "They're coming." Someone inside was pulling back the latch. At first all I saw was the light behind the figure, and the very narrow margin she allowed. Then the light from the carriage lanterns glinted in her eye. "A room for the night?" I said in German, "and my horses need tending badly." "The night's no time for traveling," she said to me in a peculiar flat voice. "And with a child?" As she said this, I noticed others in the room behind her. I could hear their murmurings and see the flickering of a fire. From what I could see, there were mostly peasants gathered around it, except for one man who was dressed much like myself in a tailored coat, with an overcoat over his shoulders, but his clothes were neglected and shabby. His red hair gleamed in the firelight. He was a foreigner, like ourselves, and he was the only one not looking at us. His head wagged slightly as if he were drunk. "My daughter's tired," I said to the woman. "We've no place to stay but here." And now I took Claudia into my arms. She turned her face towards me, and I heard her whisper, "Louis the garlic, the crucifix above the door." I had not seen these things. It was a small crucifix with the body of Christ in bronze, fixed to the wood, and the garlic was wreathed around it, a fresh garland entwined with an old one, in which the buds were withered and dried. The woman's eye followed my eyes, and then she looked at me sharply, and I could see how exhausted she was, how red were her pupils, and how the hand which clutched at the shawl at her breast trembled. Her black hair was completely disheveled. I pressed nearer until I was almost at the threshold, and she opened the door wide suddenly as if she'd only just decided to let us in. She said a prayer as I passed her. I was sure of it, though I couldn't understand the Slavic words. The small, low-beamed room was filled with people, men and women along the rough paneled walls, and benches, and even on the floor. It was as if the entire village were gathered there. A child slept in a woman's lap, and another slept on the staircase, bundled in blankets, his knees tucked in against one step, his arms making a pillow for his head on the next, and everywhere there was the garlic hanging from nails and hooks, along with the cooking pots and flagons. The fire was the only light, and it threw distorting shadows on the still faces as they watched us. No one motioned for us to sit or offered us anything, and finally the woman told me in German I might take the horses into the stable if I liked. She was staring at me with those slightly wild red-rimmed eyes, and then her face softened. She told me she'd stand at the inn door for me with a lantern, but I must hurry and leave the child here. But something else had distracted me, a scent I detected beneath the heavy fragrance of burning wood and the wine. It was the scent of death. I could feel Claudia's hand press my chest, and I saw her tiny finger pointing to a door at the foot of the stairs. The scent came from there. The woman had a cup of wine waiting when I returned, and a bowl of broth. I sat down, Claudia on my knee, her head turned away from the fire, towards that mysterious door. All eyes were fixed on us as before, except for the foreigner. I could see his profile now clearly. He was much younger than I'd thought, his haggard appearance stemming from emotion. He had a lean but very pleasant face actually, his light freckled skin making him seem like a boy. His wide blue eyes were fixed on the fire, as though he were talking to it, and his eyelashes and eyebrows were golden in the light, which gave him a very innocent, open expression. But he was miserable, disturbed, drunk. Suddenly he turned to me, and I saw he'd been crying. "Do you speak English?" he said, his voice booming in the silence. "Yes, I do," I said to him, and he glanced at the others triumphantly. They stared at him stonily. "You speak English?" he cried, his lips stretching into a bitter smile, his eyes moving around the ceiling, and then fixing on mine. "Get out of this country," he said. "Get out of it now. Take your carriage, your horses, drive them till they drop, but get out of it." Then his shoulders convulsed as if he were sick. He put his hand to his mouth. The woman, who stood against the wall now, her arms folded over her soiled apron, said calmly in German, "At dawn you can go, at dawn." "But what is it?" I whispered to her, and then I looked to him. He was watching me, his eyes glassy and red. No one spoke. A log fell heavily in the fire. "Won't you tell me?" I asked the Englishman gently. He stood up. For a moment I thought he was going to fall. He loomed over me, a much taller man than myself, his head pitching forward, then backward, before he righted himself and put his hands on the edge of the table. His black coat was stained with wine, and so was his shirt cuff. "You want to see?" he gasped as he peered into my eyes. "Do you want to see for yourself?" There was a soft, pathetic tone to his voice as he spoke these words. "Leave the child," said the woman abruptly, with a quick, imperious gesture. "She's sleeping," I said. And rising, I followed the Englishman to the door at the foot of the stairs. There was a slight commotion as those nearest the door moved away from it, and we entered a small parlor together. Only one candle burned on the sideboard, and the first thing I saw was a row of delicately painted plates on a shelf. There were curtains on the small window, and a gleaming picture of the Virgin Mary, and Christ Child on the wall. But the walls and chairs barely enclosed a great oak table, and on that table lay the body of a young woman, her white hands folded on her breast, her auburn hair mussed and tucked about her thin white throat and under her shoulders. Her pretty face was already hard with death. Amber rosary beads gleamed around her wrist and down the side of her dark wool skirt. And beside her lay a very pretty red felt hat with a wide, soft brim, and a veil, and a pair of dark gloves. It was all laid there as if she would very soon rise and put these things on. and the Englishman patted the hat carefully now as he drew close to her. He was on the verge of breaking down altogether. He'd drawn a large handkerchief out of his coat, and he had put it to his face. "Do you know what they want to do with her?" he whispered as he looked at me. "Do you have any idea?" The woman came in behind us and reached for his arm, but he roughly shook her off. "Do you know?" he demanded of me with his eyes fierce. "Savages!" "You stop now," she said under her breath. He clenched his teeth and shook his head, so that a shock of his red hair loosened in his eyes. "You get away from me," he said to the woman in German. "Get away from me." Someone was whispering in the other room. The Englishman looked again at the young woman, and his eyes filled with tears. "So innocent," he said softly. And then he glanced at the ceiling, and making a fist with his right hand, he gasped, "Damn you, God, damn you!" "Lord," the woman whispered, and quickly she made the sign of the cross. "Do you see this?" he asked me, and he pried very carefully at the lace of the dead woman's throat, as though he did not wish to actually touch the hardening flesh. There on her throat, unmistakable, were the 2 puncture wounds, as I'd seen them 1,000 times upon 1,000, engraved in the yellowing skin. The man drew his hands up to his face, his tall, lean body rocking on the balls of his feet. "I think I'm going mad," he said. "Come now," said the woman, holding on to him as he struggled, her face suddenly flushed. "Let him be," I said to her. "Just let him be. I'll take care of him." Her mouth contorted. "I'll throw you all out of here, out into that dark, if you don't stop." She was too weary for this, too close to some breaking point herself. But then she turned her back on us, drawing her shawl tight around her, and patted softly out the men who'd gathered at the door, making way for her. The Englishman was crying. I could see what I must do, but it wasn't only that I wanted so much to learn from him, my heart pounding with silent excitement. It was heartrending to see him this way. Fate brought me too mercilessly close to him. "I'll stay with you," I offered, and I brought 2 chairs up beside the table. He sat down heavily, his eyes on the flickering candle at his side. I shut the door, and the wall seemed to recede and the circle of the candle to grow brighter around his bowed head. He leaned back against the sideboard and wiped his face with his handkerchief. Then he drew a leather-bound flask from his pocket and offered it to me, and I said no. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" He nodded. "Perhaps you can bring some sanity to this place," he said. "You're a Frenchman, aren't you? You know I'm English." "Yes," I nodded. And then, pressing my hand fervently, the liquor so dulling his senses that he never felt the coldness of it, he told me his name was Morgan. And he needed me desperately, more than he'd ever needed anyone in his life. And at that moment, holding that hand, feeling the fever of it, I did a strange thing. I told him my name, which I confided to almost no one. But he was looking at the dead woman as if he hadn't heard me, his lips forming what appeared to be the faintest smile, the tears standing in his eyes. His expression would have moved any human being. It might have been more than some could bear. "I did this," he said, nodding. "I brought her here," and he raised his eyebrows as if wondering at it. "No," I said quickly, "you didn't do it. Tell me who did." But then he seemed confused, lost in thought. "I'd never been out of England," he started. "I was painting, you see," as if it mattered now. "The paintings, the book, I thought it all so quaint, so picturesque." His eyes moved over the room, his voice trailing off. For a long time he looked at her again, and then softly he said to her, "Emily," and I felt I'd glimpsed something precious he held to his heart. Gradually then the story began to come. A honeymoon journey through Germany into this country, wherever the regular coaches would carry them, wherever Morgan found scenes to paint. And they'd come to this remote place finally because there was a ruined monastery nearby, which was said to be a very well-reserved place. But Morgan and Emily had never reached that monastery. Tragedy had been waiting for them here. It turned out the regular coaches did not come this way, and Morgan had paid a farmer to bring them by cart. But the afternoon they'd arrived, there was a great commotion in the cemetery outside of town. The farmer, taking one look, refused to leave his cart to see further. It was some kind of procession, it seemed, Morgan said, with all the people outfitted in their best, and some with flowers. And the truth was, I thought it quite fascinating. I wanted to see it. I was so eager I had the fellow leave us, bags and all. We could see the village just up ahead. Actually, it was I more than Emily, of course, but she was so agreeable, you see. I left her finally seated on our suitcases, and I went up on the hill without her. Did you see it when you were coming, the cemetery? No. Of course you didn't. Thank God that carriage of yours brought you here safe and sound. Though if you'd driven on, no matter how bad off your horses were, he stopped. What's the danger? I urged him gently. Ah, danger, barbarians, he murmured, and he glanced at the door. Then he took another drink from his flask and capped it. Well, it was no procession. I saw that right off, he said. The people wouldn't even speak to me when I came up. You know what they are. But they had no objection to letting me watch. The truth was, you wouldn't have thought I was standing there at all. You won't believe me when I tell you what I saw. But you must believe me, because if you don't, I'm mad. I know it. I will believe you. Go on, I said. Well, the cemetery was full of fresh graves. I saw that at once, some of them with new wooden crosses and some of them just mounds of earth with flowers still fresh. And the peasants there, they were holding flowers, a few of them, as though they meant to be trimming these graves, but all of them were standing stock still, their eyes on these two fellows who had a white horse by the bridle. And what an animal that was! It was pawing and stomping and shying to one side, as if it wanted no part of the place. A beautiful thing it was, though, a splendid animal, a stallion in pure white. Well, at some point, and I couldn't tell you how they agreed upon it, because not a one of them said a word. One fellow, the leader, I think, gave the horse a tremendous whack with the handle of a shovel, and it took off up the hill just wild. You can imagine I thought that was the last we'd see of that horse for a while for sure, but I was wrong. In a minute it had slowed to a gallop, and it was turning around amongst the old graves and coming back down the hill towards the newer ones. And the people all stood there watching it. No one made a sound, and here it came trotting right over the mounds, right through the flowers, and no one made a move to get hold of the bridle. And then suddenly it came to a stop right on one of the graves. He wiped at his eyes, but the tears were almost gone. He seemed fascinated with his tale, as I was. Well, here's what happened, he continued. The animal just stood there, and suddenly a cry went up from the crowd. No, it wasn't a cry. It was as though they were all gasping and moaning, and then everything went quiet. And the horse was just standing there, tossing its head, and finally this fellow, who was the leader, burst forward and shouted to several of the others, and one of the women, she screamed, and threw herself on the grave almost under the horse's hooves. I came up then as close as I could. I could see the stone with the deceased's name on it. It was a young woman, dead only 6 months. The date's carved right there. And there was this miserable woman on her knees in the dirt, with her arms around the stone now, as if she meant to pull it up, right up out of the earth, and these fellows trying to pick her up and get her away. Now I almost turned back, but I couldn't. Not until I saw what they meant to do, and of course Emily was quite safe, and none of these people took the slightest notice of us either. Well, 2 of them finally did have that woman up, and then the other had come with shovels and had begun to dig right into the grave. Pretty soon one of them was down in the grave, and everyone was so still you could hear the slightest sound, that shovel digging in there, and the earth thrown up in a heap. I can't tell you what it was like. Here was the sun high above us, and not a cloud in the sky, and all of them standing around, holding on to one another now, and even that pathetic woman. He stopped now, because his eyes had fallen on Emily. I just sat there waiting for him. I could hear the whiskey when he lifted the flask again, and I felt glad for him that there was so much there that he could drink it and deaden this pain. It might as well have been midnight on that hill, he said, looking at me, his voice very low. That's how it felt. And then I could hear this fellow in the grave. He was cracking the coffin lid with his shovel. Then out came the broken boards. He was just tossing them out right and left. And suddenly he let out an awful cry. The other fellows drew up close, and all at once there was a rush to the grave. And then they all fell back like a wave, all of them crying out, and some of them turning and trying to push away. And the poor woman, she was wild, bending her knees and trying to get free of those men that were holding on to her. Well, I couldn't help but go up. I don't suppose anything could have kept me away, and I'll tell you that's the first time I've ever done such a thing, and God help me, it's to be the last. Now you must believe me, you must, but there, right there in that coffin with that fellow standing on the broken boards over her feet was the dead woman. And I tell you, she was as fresh as pink. His voice cracked, and he sat there, his eyes wide, his hand poised as if he held something invisible in his fingers, pleading with me to believe him. as pink as if she were alive, buried 6 months, and there she lay. The shroud was thrown back off her, and her hands lay on her breast just as if she were asleep. He sighed, his hand dropped to his leg, and he shook his head. And for a moment he just sat staring. "I swear to you," he said. And then this fellow who was in the grave, he bent down and lifted the dead woman's hand. I tell you that arm moved as freely as my arm, and he held her hand out as if he were looking at her nails. Then he shouted, and that woman beside the grave, she was kicking at those fellows and shoving at the earth with her foot. So it fell right down in the corpse's face and hair. And oh, she was so pretty, that dead woman. Oh, if you could have seen her, and what they did then. "Tell me what they did," I said to him softly, but I knew before he said it. "I tell you," he said, "we don't know the meaning of something like that until we see it." And he looked at me, his eyebrows arched as if he were confiding a terrible secret. "We just don't know." "No, we don't," I said. "I'll tell you. They took a stake. A wooden stake, mind you, and this one in the grave. He took the stake with a hammer and he put it right to her breast. I didn't believe it. And then with one great blow he drove it right into her. I tell you, I couldn't have moved even if I wanted to. I was rooted there. And then that fellow, that beastly fellow, he reached up for his shovel, and with both his arms he drove it sharp right into the dead woman's throat. The head was off like that. He shut his eyes, his face contorted, and put his head to the side. I looked at him, but I wasn't seeing him at all. I was seeing this woman in her grave, with the head severed, and I was feeling the most keen revulsion inside myself, as if a hand were pressing on my throat and my insides were coming up inside me and I couldn't breathe. Then I felt Claudia's lip against my wrist. She was staring at Morgan, and apparently she had been for some time. Slowly Morgan looked up at me, his eyes wild. "It was what they want to do with her," he said with Emily. "Well, I won't let them." He shook his head adamantly. "I won't let them. You've got to help me, Louis." His lips were trembling, and his face so distorted now by his sudden desperation that I might have recoiled from it despite myself. "The same blood flows in our veins, you and I. I mean French, English. We're civilized men, Louis. They're savages." "Try to be calm now, Morgan," I said, reaching out for him. "I want you to tell me what happened then, you and Emily." He was struggling for his bottle. I drew it out of his pocket, and he took off the cap. "That's a fellow, Louis. That's a friend," he said emphatically. "You see, I took her away fast. They were going to burn that corpse right there in the cemetery, and Emily was not to see that, not while He shook his head. "There wasn't a carriage to be found that would take us out of here. Not a single one of them. We leave now for the 2 days' drive to get us to a decent place." "But how did they explain it to you, Morgan?" I insisted. I could see he did not have much time left. "Vampires!" he burst out, the whiskey sloshing on his hand. "Vampires, Louis, can you believe that?" And he gestured to the door with the bottle. "A plague of vampires," all this in whispers, as if the devil himself were listening at the door. Of course, God have mercy, they put a stop to it. That unfortunate woman in the cemetery, they stopped her from clawing her way up nightly to feed on the rest of us. He put the bottle to his lips. "Oh, God," he moaned. I watched him drink, patiently waiting. "And Emily," he continued. She thought it fascinating, what with the fire out there and a decent dinner and a proper glass of wine. She hadn't seen that woman. She hadn't seen what they'd done," he said desperately. "Oh, I wanted to get out of here." I offered them money. "If it's over," I kept saying to them, "one of you ought to want this money, a small fortune, just to drive us out of here." "But it wasn't over," I whispered. And I could see the tears gathering in his eyes, his mouth twisting with pain. "How did it happen to her?" I asked him. "I don't know," he gasped, shaking his head. The flask pressed to his forehead as if it were something cool, refreshing, when it was not. "It came into the inn. They said she went out to it," he confessed, the tears coursing down his cheeks. "Everything was locked. They saw to that, doors, windows. Then it was morning, and they were all shouting, and she was gone. The window stood wide open, and she wasn't there. I didn't even take time for my robe. I was running. I came to a dead halt over her out there behind the inn. My foot all but came down on her. She was just lying there under the peach trees. She held an empty cup, clinging to it, an empty cup. They said it lured her. She was trying to give it water." The flask slipped from his hands. He clapped his hands over his ears. His body bent, his head bowed. For a long time I sat there watching him. I had no words to say to him. And when he cried softly that they wanted to desecrate her, that they said she, Emily, was now a vampire, I assured him softly, though I don't think he ever heard me, that she was not. He moved forward finally as if he might fall. He appeared to be reaching for the candle, and before his arm rested on the buffet, his finger touched it so the hot wax extinguished the tiny bit that was left of the wick. We were in darkness then, and his head had fallen on his arm. All of the light of the room seemed gathered now in Claudia's eyes, but as the silence lengthened and I sat there wondering, hoping Morgan wouldn't lift his head again, the woman came to the door. Her candle illuminated him, drunk, asleep. "You go now," she said to me. Dark figures crowded around her, and the old wooden inn was alive with the shuffling of men and women. "Go by the fire." "What are you going to do?" I demanded of her, rising and holding Claudia. "I want to know what you propose to do." "Go by the fire," she commanded. "No, don't do this," I said, but she narrowed her eyes and bared her teeth. "You go," she growled. "Morgan," I said to him, but he didn't hear me. He couldn't hear me. "Leave him be," said the woman fiercely. "But it's stupid what you're doing. Don't you understand? This woman's dead," I pleaded with her. "Louis," Claudia whispered, so that they couldn't hear her, her arm tightening around my neck beneath the fur of my hood. "Let these people alone."